Ward was unbearable. The radiation had destroyed the patient's immune systems, allowing bacteria to rapidly decompose their bodies while they were still alive. Nurses had to wear full protective equipment and could only spend a few minutes at a time in the ward. Lyudmila Ignatenko, Vasily's wife, was pregnant at the time. Against all warnings and hospital protocols, she spent every day by her husband's bedside. One photograph shows her holding his hand, which by this point had swollen to 3 times its normal size and had turned completely black. She later recounted how his body began to fall apart. His skin would peel off in sheets, his internal organs were failing one by one, and toward the end, even his bones were crumbling. Vasily Ignatenko died on May 13, 1986, just 14 days after the explosion. His body was so radioactive that it had to be buried in a lead coffin, encased in concrete. Lyudmila's baby daughter was born 6 months later with severe cirrhosis of the liver and multiple heart defects. She died 4 hours after birth, having absorbed massive amounts of radiation while in the womb. The Soviet government confiscated all photographs of the Hospital No. 6 patients and classified them for decades. They showed the true cost of the disaster, the human suffering that official reports conveniently omitted. The liquidators. In the days and weeks following the explosion, the Soviet Union mobilized over 600,000 men, known as liquidators, to clean up the disaster site and prevent further catastrophe. These men came from all over the Soviet Union, many of them conscripted military personnel who had no choice but to serve. One of the most incredible series of banned photographs shows the bio-robots, liquidators who were sent onto the roof of Reactor 3 to clear radioactive debris. The radiation levels were so high that even robots malfunctioned and broke down, so the Soviet government decided to use humans instead. Each liquidator was given a lead vest, a shovel, and told they had exactly 90 seconds to run onto the roof, shovel debris into the destroyed reactor, and run back. In reality, most received a fatal dose of radiation in less than 40 seconds. The photographs show lines of men waiting their turn, like soldiers going over the top in World War I, knowing that they might not come back. One particularly haunting photograph shows a liquidator's lead vest, left abandoned on the roof. You can see the outline of where the man's body was protected, but his arms, legs, and head received no protection at all. The exposure to these unprotected areas would have caused immediate and severe radiation burns. Another classified photograph shows the decontamination process. Liquidators who had worked in high radiation zones were told to shower and wash their clothes. What the photograph reveals is the utter futility of this process. Men are seen standing under makeshift showers, but the radiation has already penetrated their bodies. The water washing off them was so contaminated that it glowed in the dark, a phenomenon caused by Cherenkov radiation. The Soviet government kept detailed records of every liquidator, including photographs for identification purposes. These records, declassified in the 2000s, tell a grim story. Of the 600,000 liquidators, an estimated 60,000 died within 20 years of the disaster from radiation-related illnesses. Tens of thousands more developed cancers, heart disease, and neurological disorders. The evacuation of Pripyat was a city built specifically to house the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. With a population of nearly 50,000, it was a modern Soviet showcase with apartment buildings, schools, hospitals, and even an amusement park that was set to open on May 1st, 1986. For 36 hours after the explosion, the residents of Pripyat went about their daily lives, completely unaware of the danger they were in. Children played outside, people went to work, and life continued as normal. The Soviet government didn't want to cause panic, so they said nothing. A series of photographs taken by residents during those 36 hours, later confiscated by authorities, show everyday life in Pripyat as radiation levels continued to climb. In one image, children are playing in a playground, kicking up dust that was heavily contaminated with radioactive particles. In another, a wedding party is being photographed outside, with the damaged reactor visible in the background, still smoking. On April 27th at 2 p.m., exactly 36.5 hours after the explosion, loudspeakers throughout Pripyat announced that the city was being evacuated. Residents were told to take only essential items and that they would be able to return within 3 days. It was a lie. Pripyat would never be inhabited again. Photographs of the evacuation, taken by Soviet military photographers and immediately classified, show the chaos and confusion. Over 1,200 buses lined the streets, and residents were loaded on with banned photos from Chernobyl, that Soviet Union, HID from the world. The night that changed everything, April 26, 1986, 1:23 a.m., the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located in the northern Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, was about to become the site of the worst nuclear disaster in human history. But what the world saw in the days, months, and years that followed was carefully curated by the Soviet government. The real horror, captured in photographs that were immediately classified, hidden, and in many cases destroyed, told a far more terrifying story. Today, we're going to reveal those banned photographs and the stories behind them. Stories of heroism, tragedy, and the devastating human cost of the Chernobyl disaster that the Soviet Union desperately tried to hide from the world. The reactor. Before the explosion, in the weeks leading up to the disaster, several photographers documented life at the Chernobyl facility. These images show workers going about their daily routines, completely unaware that they were working inside what would soon become a ticking time bomb. One particular photograph, taken just 3 days before the explosion, shows reactor number 4 from the outside. The workers in the frame are smiling, some are smoking cigarettes during their break. None of them knew that within 72 hours, this same reactor would explode with a force equivalent to 500 nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima. The Soviet government later confiscated every photograph taken inside the plant during those final weeks. Officials claimed they were protecting state secrets, but the real reason was far more sinister. They wanted to erase any evidence that might suggest the disaster was preventable, that safety protocols had been ignored, and that workers had raised concerns that fell on deaf ears. The first responders. When Reactor 4 exploded at 1:23 a.m., it sent a plume of radioactive material 2 kilometers into the sky. The night shift workers who witnessed the explosion had no idea what they were looking at. Some described it as beautiful, like a light show, with blue and red flames dancing into the night sky. What they were actually seeing was ionized air, a phenomenon that occurs only during extreme radiation exposure. The first firefighters arrived within minutes. A photograph taken by an unknown photographer later confiscated by the KGB, shows these men suiting up. They're wearing regular firefighting gear, completely inadequate for what they were about to face. Their faces show determination, even excitement. This was, after all, just another fire to put out. Or so they thought. Lieutenant Vladimir Pripyat led the first team onto the roof of Reactor 3, directly adjacent to the exploded Reactor 4. The heat was so intense that the soles of their boots melted into the tar roof. The radiation levels were lethal, but none of the firefighters had dosimeters that could measure beyond 3.6 roentgens per hour. The actual radiation levels on that roof exceeded 20,000 roentgens per hour. To put that in perspective, 400 roentgens is considered a lethal dose. These men were being bombarded with radiation at a rate 50 times that amount. A series of photographs taken by Anatoly Raskazov, a plant photographer, documented the firefighters' efforts throughout that first night. In one image, you can see the silhouettes of men on the roof, backlit by the glow of the burning reactor. In another, firefighters are seen directing water onto the flames, completely unaware that they were standing in the most radioactive place on Earth. By dawn, most of these first responders were already feeling the effects: nausea, vomiting, dizziness, and an unusual metallic taste in their mouths. Within hours, their skin began to change color, turning dark red, then brown, then black. The radiation was literally cooking them from the inside out. Hospital number 6, Moscow. The most disturbing photographs from the Chernobyl disaster were taken inside Hospital number 6 in Moscow, where the most critically injured were taken. These images were classified as top secret and were locked away in Soviet archives until the late 1990s. The photographs show rows of hospital beds, each containing a firefighter or plant worker who had received fatal doses of radiation. But these weren't ordinary hospital patients. Acute radiation syndrome doesn't just make you sick, it destroys your body at the cellular level. One photograph shows a firefighter named Vasily Ignatenko lying in his hospital bed 6 days after the disaster. His face is swollen beyond recognition, his skin has turned a dark purple color, and his body is covered in radiation burns that look like severe chemical burns. But the most haunting detail is his eyes, still alert, still aware of what's happening to him. The photographer who took these images, whose identity remains unknown to this day, noted in the margins of the contact sheets that the stench in their small bags of belongings, the expressions on their faces show confusion, worry, but not yet understanding of the magnitude of what had happened. One photograph shows an elderly woman being carried onto a bus by soldiers. She's clutching a bird cage with her pet canary inside. Pets were not supposed to be evacuated. The official order was that all animals should be left behind. But in the chaos, some slipped through. That canary would be dead within a week from radiation exposure. The abandoned city. After the evacuation, Pripyat became a ghost town frozen in time. Soviet photographers were sent in to document the abandoned city, but these photographs were never meant for public consumption. They were classified and used only for internal government reports. These images show a city that looks like the rapture has occurred. Dinner tables are still set with food, classrooms have children's drawings still pinned to the walls, and the famous amusement park stands silent, its Ferris wheel never having given a single ride. One particularly eerie photograph shows the main square of Pripyat, taken from the top of a building. The square is completely empty. Papers and leaves are blowing through the streets, and in the distance you can see the damaged reactor still smoking. The photograph was taken at noon on a weekday, a time when this square would normally be full of people. The silence captured in that image is deafening. Another classified photograph shows the Pripyat hospital nursery. Rows of cribs are lined up, each still containing dolls and toys left behind when the babies were evacuated. On one wall, someone has written in chalk the names of all the babies who were in the nursery that day. It was later discovered that many of those babies developed thyroid cancer and other radiation-related illnesses in the years that followed. The Soviet government sent in liquidators to decontaminate Pripyat, a hopeless task given the levels of radiation. Photographs show men in protective suits washing buildings, burying contaminated soil, and even shooting the pets that had been left behind. Dogs and cats, now highly radioactive and potentially dangerous, had to be eliminated. The liquidators tasked with this job reported that it was one of the hardest things they ever had to do. Some of the animals recognized humans and would run up to them, expecting to be taken home. The basement of death beneath Reactor 4 lies a labyrinth of corridors, pipes, and rooms that make up the plant's basement. In the days following the explosion, these areas became flooded with highly radioactive water. If this water had reached the other reactors or leaked into the groundwater, it could have caused a catastrophic secondary explosion or poisoned the water supply for millions of people. On May 4, 1986, 3 engineers volunteered to enter the basement and manually open drainage valves to release the radioactive water into containment pools. Their names were Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov. They knew it was a suicide mission, but they went anyway. A single classified photograph exists of these 3 men, taken just before they entered the basement. They're wearing diving suits and carrying flashlights, about to descend into water so radioactive that being in it for just a few minutes would be fatal. The photograph shows their faces through the diving helmets. They're not smiling, but there's a determination in their eyes, an understanding of the importance of what they're about to do. They descended into the darkness, swimming through radioactive water in pitch-black conditions, following diagrams and memory to find the valves. After what must have felt like an eternity, they succeeded. The valves were opened, the water was drained, and a second explosion was prevented. All 3 men survived the mission, defying everyone's expectations. However, Baranov died 2 weeks later from acute radiation syndrome. Ananenko and Bespalov survived, though both suffered long-term health effects. A follow-up photograph, taken in 2006, shows Ananenko and Bespalov, now in their 60s, standing in front of the Chernobyl monument. They're gray-haired, weathered, but alive. Heroes who saved potentially millions of lives, their story hidden by the Soviet government for years. The elephant's foot. Perhaps the most infamous banned photograph from Chernobyl is the image known as the elephant's foot. In the basement of Reactor 4, the nuclear fuel that had melted down formed a new substance, a mixture of nuclear fuel, concrete, sand, and other materials that had been pulled into the reactor core. This substance, called corium, is the most dangerous material on Earth. The corium flowed through the reactor like lava, eventually solidifying in the basement into a formation that resembled an elephant's foot. The radiation emitted by this mass was so intense that standing next to it for just 30 seconds would cause dizziness and fatigue. 2 minutes of exposure would cause cells to hemorrhage. 4 minutes would be fatal within 48 hours. In December 1986, a photographer named Artur Korneyev was sent to photograph the elephant's foot. The photograph he took is one of the most radioactive objects in the world. The radiation was so intense that it interfered with the camera, causing strange distortions and spots in the image. Korneyev could only stay in the room for a few seconds at a time, running in, taking a quick photo, and running out. The photograph shows a dark, textured mass that does indeed resemble an elephant's foot. It's strangely organic looking, almost alive, which makes it even more disturbing. This mass contains enough radioactive material to contaminate the entire planet if it were to be dispersed. It will remain deadly for at least 100,000 years. Korneyev, incredibly, survived his exposure and continued to work at Chernobyl for many years. However, he accumulated a lifetime dose of radiation that will likely shorten his life. The photograph he took was immediately classified and wouldn't be seen publicly until the late 1990s. The secret cemetery outside of Moscow, in a forest that doesn't appear on any official map, lies a secret cemetery. Here, buried in lead-lined coffins and covered with thick concrete slabs, are many of the first responders and liquidators who died from acute radiation syndrome. Photographs of this cemetery, taken secretly by a journalist in 1997, show rows of concrete tombs stretching into the forest. Each tomb is marked with a simple plaque bearing a name, date of birth, and date of death. What's chilling is how many of the death dates are between April and June 1986. The cemetery is still highly radioactive. The bodies buried there are so contaminated that they will remain dangerous for centuries. Anyone visiting the cemetery even today is advised not to stay longer than 15 minutes and should bring a dosimeter to monitor radiation levels. One photograph shows a woman, identified as Maria Gorbacheva, kneeling at one of the graves. Her son, Igor, was a liquidator who died in May 1986 at the age of 23. She made the journey to this secret cemetery every year on the anniversary of his death, despite the radiation risk, despite the government discouraging visits. In the photograph, she's placing flowers on the concrete tomb, her hand resting on the warm concrete, heated from the radiation still emitting from the body below. The existence of this cemetery was denied by the Soviet government for years. It was only after the fall of the Soviet Union that its location was acknowledged, and even then, authorities discouraged people from visiting. The Forbidden Zone. The 30-kilometer exclusion zone around Chernobyl was established in the weeks following the disaster. Everyone was evacuated, and the area was sealed off. The Soviet government declared that nobody would ever live there again. Photographs taken inside the zone in the months and years after the disaster, most of which were classified, tell an eerie story of nature reclaiming human civilization. In one image, taken just 6 months after the disaster, you can see a classroom in Pripyat. Vines are already starting to grow through the windows, books are scattered across the floor, and a chalkboard still shows the last lesson taught before the evacuation. Another photograph shows the Pripyat amusement park, the Ferris wheel standing silent against a gray sky. This park never opened. It was supposed to open on May 1st, 1986, just 5 days after the disaster. The Ferris wheel, now an iconic symbol of Chernobyl, never carried a single passenger. Over the years, it has become rusted and corroded, a monument to a future that never arrived. One of the most controversial classified photographs shows a military helicopter that crashed while dumping sand and boron onto the burning reactor. The helicopter is lying on its side, the crew clearly visible inside, all dead. The Soviet government claimed that only 2 helicopters crashed during the operation, but photographs suggest there were at least 5. The bodies of the crew members, too radioactive to recover, were left where they died. The returnees. Despite the government's orders, not everyone stayed away from the exclusion zone. A group of elderly residents, mostly women, who had lived in the area all their lives, refused to leave. They snuck back into the zone and reoccupied their homes. The Soviet government tried to remove them several times, but eventually gave up. These women became known as the returnees, or samoseli. A series of unauthorized photographs taken by journalist Gerd Ludwig over several visits in the 1990s and 2000s document the lives of these returnees. One image shows a woman named Hanna Zavorotnya, then in her 80s, sitting in her garden in the village of Opachechi, just 15 kilometers from the reactor. Behind her, you can see her vegetable garden, chickens wandering around, and a normal-looking cottage. But a dosimeter reading shown at the bottom of the photograph reveals radiation levels 10 times higher than safe limits. Hannah and others like her chose to return because, as she explained, the psychological toll of being displaced from their homes was worse than the physical risk of radiation. They knew they were living in a dangerous area, but this was their home, and they refused to die anywhere else. Studies of these returnees have shown something surprising. While they do have higher rates of certain cancers, many have lived into their 80s and 90s. Some scientists theorize that the stress of displacement and living in unfamiliar environments might be as harmful as low-level radiation exposure. It's a controversial theory, but one that these returnees seem to support with their longevity. The new safe confinement by the late 1980s, it was clear that the hastily constructed sarcophagus that had been built around Reactor 4 was failing. It was leaking, structurally unstable, and wouldn't last more than a few decades. If it collapsed, it could release another massive cloud of radioactive particles. In 2016, after years of international cooperation and billions of dollars in funding, the new safe confinement was completed. It's the largest movable structure ever built, a massive steel arch that was constructed near the reactor and then slid into place over the old sarcophagus. The construction of this structure was documented extensively, and many previously classified photographs from the 1980s and 1990s were released to show the progression of the deterioration. One particularly striking photograph from 1991 shows workers inside the old sarcophagus, which by that point had developed numerous cracks and holes. These workers, wearing minimal protective equipment, are shown reinforcing structural elements while radiation levels around them exceed 500 Röntgens per hour. Another photograph shows the interior of the reactor hall, taken in 2014, just before the new safe confinement was put in place. The roof of the old sarcophagus has partially collapsed, and you can see directly into the destroyed reactor. Twisted metal, collapsed concrete, and the eerie glow of Cherenkov radiation create a scene that looks more like science fiction than reality. The new safe confinement is designed to last 100 years, giving scientists time to figure out how to safely dismantle the reactor and remove the radioactive fuel. But even with this new structure, Chernobyl will remain dangerous for tens of thousands of years. The genetic legacy. Perhaps the most disturbing banned photographs from Chernobyl are those showing the long-term health effects, particularly on children. In the years following the disaster, hospitals across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia began seeing a dramatic increase in birth defects, childhood cancers, and genetic abnormalities. One classified medical photograph, taken in 1990, shows a baby born with severe birth defects attributed to radiation exposure. The image is difficult to look at, showing abnormalities so severe that the child lived only a few hours. Thousands of similar cases were documented but kept secret by Soviet authorities who didn't want to acknowledge the long-term consequences of the disaster. Thyroid cancer rates in children living in the affected areas increased by 2,700% in the decade following Chernobyl. Photographs from pediatric oncology wards show rooms full of children, many of them bald from chemotherapy, all suffering from a disease that was extremely rare in children before 1986. One photograph, taken by American photographer Paul Fusco in 1997, shows a children's ward in Minsk, Belarus. The children in the photograph are playing with toys, trying to maintain some semblance of normal childhood despite their illness. But what makes the image so powerful is what you can't see in the photograph. These children are among the lucky ones. They survived. Thousands of others didn't. The Soviet and later Russian governments have consistently downplayed the health effects of Chernobyl. Official death tolls range from 31 to 50 people, counting only those who died immediately from acute radiation syndrome. Independent researchers estimate the true death toll, when including long-term radiation-related illnesses, is between 30,000 and 60,000 people. Some estimates go even higher. The truth revealed. For decades, the Soviet Union maintained strict control over information about Chernobyl. Photographs were classified, reporters were banned from the area, and anyone who spoke about the disaster was silenced. But after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the truth began to emerge. Archives were opened, classified documents were leaked, and survivors started telling their stories. The photographs that had been hidden for years finally saw the light of day, revealing the true horror of what happened at Chernobyl. Today, Chernobyl has become a strange tourist destination. Thousands of people visit the exclusion zone each year, walking through the abandoned buildings of Pripyat, taking selfies in front of the new safe confinement, and marveling at how nature has reclaimed the area. But those visitors don't see what's in these banned photographs. They don't see the firefighters dying in agony in Hospital Number 6. They don't see the liquidators lining up for their 90-second missions on the reactor roof. They don't see the babies born with severe birth defects or the children dying from thyroid cancer. These photographs tell the real story of Chernobyl, a story of human courage in the face of unimaginable horror, of government cover-ups and lies, and of a disaster whose effects will last for thousands of years. The Soviet Union is gone, but Chernobyl remains, a permanent scar on the landscape and a reminder of what can happen when technology fails and governments prioritize secrecy over safety. Conclusion: the banned photographs from Chernobyl that we've explored today reveal a truth that the Soviet government tried desperately to hide. This wasn't just a nuclear accident, it was a catastrophe that destroyed lives, families, and entire communities. The first responders who rushed into danger, the liquidators who sacrificed their health to prevent an even greater disaster, and the countless innocent victims who suffered from radiation exposure all deserve to be remembered. These photographs, once classified and hidden away, now serve as a testament to their sacrifice and a warning to future generations. Nuclear power, while potentially beneficial, carries risks that we must never underestimate. The Chernobyl disaster taught us that lesson in the most horrific way possible. As we look at these images, we're not just seeing historical artifacts. We're seeing human faces, real people who lived through the worst nuclear disaster in history. Their stories, preserved in these banned photographs, must never be forgotten.